1900s, Kingston, Jamaica, was a city of stark contrasts: wealth and poverty, colonial power, and working-class struggle. In the midst of it all, a young man named Marcus Garvey was beginning his journey, a man who would become one of the most influential black leaders in history. This is his story. Born on August 17, 1887, Marcus Mosiah Garvey was the youngest of 4 children born to Malchus and Sarah Garvey. Marcus was never very close to his father, who was described as a strict disciplinarian and aloof. He did, however, inherit from his father a love of books and reading. In 1905, Garvey moved to Kingston from his home parish of St. Anne, seeking a job opportunity. He found work at the P.A. Benjamin Manufacturing Company and quickly rose through the ranks to become their first Afro-Jamaican foreman, a rare achievement in a racially divided society. This was a crucial moment. He was proving that black Jamaicans could lead, but at the same time, he was seeing firsthand the struggles of the working class. Determined to make a difference, Garvey became vice president of the Printers' Union. He took a leading role in the 1908 print workers' strike, a bold move that cost him his job. Branded a troublemaker, he found himself blacklisted from private sector work. Garvey experienced firsthand the consequences of standing up to colonial power. But instead of retreating, he became even more determined to fight for the working class. In 1910, he helped publish The Struggling Mass, a pamphlet advocating for the rights of Jamaica's working class and opposing Indian indentured labor, which he saw as economic competition. He also launched Garvey's Watchman, his first attempt at independent journalism. Though it lasted only 3 issues, it set the stage for his future work. In mid-1910, seeking new opportunities, Garvey left Jamaica for Costa Rica. There, he worked on a United Fruit Company plantation, witnessing firsthand the exploitation of black laborers. He was outraged by the mistreatment he saw. In response, he founded a bilingual newspaper, Nation/La Nación, using his voice to expose injustice. This was a turning point. Garvey wasn't just observing injustice, he was actively fighting it through journalism. But he was forced to shut down the paper when his printing press broke. Undeterred, he continued traveling through Central America, eventually founding another newspaper, La Prensa, in Panama. In 1912, Garvey made a bold decision. He sailed to London, the heart of the British Empire. He worked as a laborer, attended classes in law, and took a job at the African Times and Orient Review, a magazine advocating for African self-rule. On a visit to the British Library, he discovered Up From Slavery, a book by African-American leader Booker T. Washington. It was a revelation. Garvey now envisioned a movement to unite black people worldwide. This was when Garvey's ideas crystallized. He saw the need for black economic independence and political unity. The seeds of the UNIA were planted. In 1914, Garvey returned to Jamaica. Inspired by his experiences, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the first step in a movement that would change the course of history. This is just the beginning of Marcus Garvey's extraordinary journey that would inspire generations to come. To sustain himself, he began selling imported greeting and condolence cards from Britain before later transitioning to selling tombstones. But Garvey's ambitions extended far beyond commerce. He was about to plant the seeds of a movement that would change the course of history. In July 1914, Garvey launched the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, UNIA, with the motto, "One Aim, One God, One Destiny." The organization pledged to unite black people across the world, instill race pride, and uplift those who had been marginalized. But in a colonial society steeped in racial divisions, acceptance was far from immediate. Many Jamaicans were wary of the term Negro, which was often used in a derogatory sense. But Garvey reclaimed it, using it to empower people of African descent. He understood the power of language in shaping identity. Operating out of a rented room on Orange Street, Kingston, Garvey took on the role of UNIA's president and traveling commissioner. Officially, the organization was not political, but focused on charity and education. Garvey envisioned a vocational training college modeled on Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. He wrote to Washington, receiving an encouraging response, yet Washington's untimely death ended what could have been a powerful alliance. At a meeting of the Queen Street Baptist Literary and Debating Society, Garvey met Amy Ashwood, a passionate and educated young woman. She quickly became involved in UNIA, securing better headquarters for the organization and deepening her bond with Garvey. The two secretly became engaged in 1915, though family opposition and personal conflicts would strain their relationship. Despite attracting donations from prominent patrons, including the mayor of Kingston and the governor of Jamaica, Garvey faced resistance from Jamaica's mixed-race middle class. They viewed him as an upstart. When unverified accusations of financial mismanagement arose, UNIA's support dwindled. Garvey, realizing that Jamaica was not fertile ground for his movement, made a bold decision to take his vision to the United States. In March 1916, Marcus Garvey set sail for America aboard the SS Tallac. Arriving in New York City, he found lodging in Harlem, a growing hub of black culture and activism. He began lecturing publicly, but faced immediate setbacks, including being heckled and falling off the stage during his first speech. Undeterred, he embarked on a grueling speaking tour, visiting 38 states and absorbing the struggles and aspirations of African Americans. As he traveled, he connected with black church leaders, studied the philosophies of African Methodist Episcopal preachers, and visited Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. These experiences sharpened his vision. By May 1917, Garvey was ready to take the next step, launching the New York branch of UNIA. For 25 cents a month, anyone of African ancestry could join. He spoke to both Afro-Caribbean immigrants and Native African Americans, bridging cultural divides. He formed alliances, notably with Hubert Harrison, a radical voice promoting black self-reliance. In the wake of the 1917 race riots, Garvey's rhetoric turned more militant. He called for armed self-defense, distributing a pamphlet condemning the violence and using the funds raised to aid victims. His growing influence did not go unnoticed. U.S. authorities, led by J. Edgar Hoover, began to monitor him closely. By 1918, UNIA had grown significantly. Garvey launched the Negro World, his own newspaper to spread his ideas. But controversy was never far behind. He faced lawsuits from unpaid journalists and tensions with socialist thinkers. Despite this, his following expanded, stretching beyond the United States to the Caribbean, Central, and South America. From humble beginnings in Jamaica to the streets of Harlem, Marcus Garvey's vision was taking shape. The world was beginning to listen. But the battles ahead would be even greater. Led by Marcus Garvey, the UNIA grew with unprecedented speed, igniting a sense of pride and purpose within the African diaspora. But with success came conflict, and with ambition came resistance. Garvey claimed 2 million members by 1919. However, UNIA remained smaller than the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, though the two organizations had overlapping supporters. The NAACP focused on racial integration and uplifted the so-called talented 10th, educated professionals such as doctors and lawyers. UNIA, on the other hand, embraced a mass movement approach, welcoming working-class African Americans and Afro-Caribbean migrants. Tensions grew between UNIA and the NAACP. Garvey saw the NAACP as elitist, while NAACP leaders viewed Garvey's ideology as counterproductive to racial integration. W.E. Du Bois and Garvey's rivalry became particularly bitter, with Du Bois calling Garvey a little fat black man, ugly but with intelligent eyes and a big head. Garvey, in turn, accused Du Bois of being under the influence of white financiers. Garvey was not just a visionary, he was an entrepreneur. He launched a restaurant, a hat store, and the ambitious Black Star Line, a shipping company aimed at economic independence for black people worldwide. The movement also established Liberty Hall in Harlem, a venue inspired by the Irish independence movement. The Black Star Line was an extraordinary idea, but its execution was flawed. Poor financial oversight and inexperience in maritime trade led to rapid decline. One ship, the SS Yarmouth, was riddled with mechanical issues, costing thousands in repairs. By 1922, the company had collapsed. UNIA faced internal strife. Garvey purged members he saw as threats. Meanwhile, the U.S. government, concerned about Garvey's growing influence, infiltrated the UNIA. The Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, sent its first black agent, James Wormley Jones, to monitor Garvey's activities. In October 1919, an assassin entered UNIA's offices and fired 4 shots at Garvey. He survived, but the attempt shook him. Shortly after, he married Amy Ashwood in a grand ceremony. But their marriage soon crumbled. Both accused the other of infidelity, and Garvey accused Amy of being lazy, a thief, and an alcoholic. They divorced in 1922. Amy never accepted the divorce, and until her death, claimed to be Garvey's true wife. Garvey remarried quickly after the divorce. He married Amy Jakes, a former personal secretary who was also a former roommate and bridesmaid to his first wife. Garvey had 2 sons with Amy Jakes. They remained married until his death. 1922 marked the height of Marcus Garvey's influence, but it was also the beginning of his most tumultuous year, a year of triumph and betrayal. In January, Marcus Garvey was arrested and charged with mail fraud. The accusation: selling stocks in a ship that the Black Star Line did not yet own. Though he was bailed for $2,500, the Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover, was determined to see him convicted. The press painted Garvey as a con artist, swindling African Americans with empty promises of economic independence. But Garvey had his theory. He blamed not the government, but his rivals within the black community. He accused the NAACP and former UNIA members of conspiring against him out of fear of his movement's success. Amidst these legal troubles, the Black Star Line was forced to halt operations, but Garvey was undeterred. He embarked on a tour of the southern and western United States, rallying support. Then, in June, a controversial decision shocked his followers. In Atlanta, Garvey met with Edward Young Clark, acting Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. His justification: a belief that black and white separatists had a common goal: the return of African Americans to Africa. The backlash was swift. Prominent black leaders launched the "Garvey Must Go" campaign. Garvey's reputation began to unravel. Despite these setbacks, Garvey continued pushing forward. His UNIA launched Booker T. Washington University and sent a delegation to the League of Nations. Yet, even within his own organization, dissent was brewing. Garvey sought to consolidate power, demanding the resignation of several high-ranking UNIA officials. When they refused, he temporarily stepped down, only to return stronger, forcing out his rivals. But his fiercest critic, Reverend James Eason, did not go quietly. He formed a rival group, the Universal Negro Alliance. Then, in January 1923, James Eason was assassinated. Garvey denied having anything to do with the murder, but the seed of doubt was strong. A group of African American intellectuals publicly denounced Garvey, calling him a demagogue, spreading hatred and distrust. Enraged, Garvey struck back with racial insults, escalating the divisions within the Black Liberation Movement. Garvey's feud with W.E. Du Bois intensified. Their ideological clash would define the future of the movement, one advocating integration, the other self-reliance and separatism. By 1923, Marcus Garvey stood at a crossroads. His movement had achieved remarkable successes, but his battles, both internal and external, had left him vulnerable. The forces against him were gathering, and soon his fate would be sealed. It was May 1923. After multiple delays, Marcus Garvey, the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, finally stood trial in a U.S. courtroom. The charge: mail fraud, tied to the financial dealings of the Black Star Line. The trial would prove to be one of the most controversial in African American history. Garvey, defiant as ever, distrusted his legal counsel. Against the advice of his lawyer, he chose to represent himself in court. Over the next month, his lack of legal expertise became evident. He cast himself as a visionary, betrayed by those around him. But the jury was unconvinced. After 10 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty. His 3 co-defendants were acquitted. Garvey erupted in anger, hurling accusations and racial slurs in the courtroom. His fury did nothing to change the outcome. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $1,000 fine. The harshness of the sentence shocked many, with some believing it was influenced by his outburst against Jewish officials involved in the case. Outside, thousands of UNIA members rallied in protest. But as Garvey sat in the Tombs prison, the movement began to fracture. Membership declined, and divisions between Caribbean and African American followers deepened. From his cell, Garvey continued to write, lashing out at his critics, particularly the NAACP. Then, in September 1923, a glimmer of hope. Judge Martin Manton granted Garvey bail for $15,000 while he appealed. Free once more, Garvey toured the country, spreading his vision of black self-sufficiency and migration to Africa. But controversy followed him. His past meeting with the Ku Klux Klan continued to haunt him, and many black leaders saw him as a dangerous demagogue. Determined to establish a black homeland, Garvey turned his eyes to Liberia. He secured a promise from President Charles D.B. King to allow 3,000 African-American settlers. But when the first UNIA representatives arrived, they were arrested and deported. The Liberian government, fearing pressure from European powers, reneged on its agreement. Garvey blamed W.E.B. Du Bois for the betrayal, an accusation that was never substantiated. By February 1925, Garvey's legal battle was over. The appeals court upheld his conviction, and his bail was revoked. He was arrested in Detroit and taken to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Inside, his health deteriorated, but his spirit remained unbroken. Outside prison walls, UNIA crumbled. Financial troubles forced the sale of Liberty Hall. The Black Star Line's last ship was sold at a fraction of its purchase price. Garvey, furious, condemned his acting successor, William Sherrill. Factions within UNIA splintered further, and the movement was never the same again. Yet Garvey still had supporters. 70,000 people signed a petition urging President Calvin Coolidge to commute his sentence. The pressure worked. In November 1927, after serving only half his term, Garvey was released. But there was a catch. He was to be deported immediately. On December 3, 1927, Marcus Garvey boarded the SS Saramacca in New Orleans. Thousands of supporters bid him farewell. His journey took him through Panama, where he was celebrated but not allowed to disembark. Finally, he arrived in Kingston, Jamaica, exiled from the country where his dream had flourished. His influence would never fully fade. Marcus Garvey's vision of black empowerment laid the foundation for future movements. Though he left the United States in exile, his message of self-reliance and pride would echo for generations to come. After years of struggle and imprisonment in the United States, Marcus Garvey is welcomed home by his supporters. The people raised $10,000 to help him rebuild his life. With these funds, he acquires a grand residence in an elite neighborhood. Garvey, undeterred, resumes his activism. He speaks passionately, urging Afro-Jamaicans to uplift themselves. Yet he also warned against the growing influence of Chinese and Syrian migrants in Jamaica, views that stir controversy. Seeking new opportunities, Garvey embarks on a global journey. He arrived in London in April 1928, where he rented a house in West Kensington. On June 6th, he takes the stage at the Royal Albert Hall, addressing a captivated audience. He then travels to Paris, Switzerland, and then Canada. Back in Kingston, Garvey secures Edelweiss Park in Crossroads as the new UNIA headquarters. A grand parade draws tens of thousands, marking the beginning of a new chapter. But Garvey's ambition extends beyond activism. He ventures into politics. He establishes Jamaica's first political party, the People's Political Party. His bold manifesto includes land reform, a minimum wage, and the creation of Jamaica's first university. But his outspoken nature leads to trouble. Charged with undermining the judiciary, he was sentenced to 3 months in prison. His time behind bars only fuels his resolve. He runs for office again, but the Great Depression takes its toll. Financial hardship forces him to auction properties, including Edelweiss Park. Disillusioned, he boards the SS Tilapa in 1935, bound for England. Leaving his wife and 2 sons, he vowed never to return. Now in London, Garvey attempts to rebuild UNIA, setting up headquarters in West Kensington and launching a new journal, Black Man. He returns to Hyde Park's Speaker's Corner, but his conservative views draw criticism from socialists. He dreams of becoming a member of parliament, but his political aspirations never materialize. In January 1940, Garvey suffered a stroke. His secretary, Daisy White, cares for him as his health declines. In May, false reports of his death circulate in newspapers. Days later, reading his own obituaries, he suffers another massive stroke. On June 10, 1940, Marcus Garvey died in London at the age of 52. Garvey's passing sparks worldwide mourning. Harlem erupts in grief. In Kingston, thousands gather for his memorial. Some refuse to believe he is truly gone, insisting it is all part of a conspiracy. Legal battles over his legacy ensue, as both of his wives claim the title of Mrs. Marcus Garvey. By the 1950s, a veritable cult surrounds Garvey's memory in Jamaica. In 1964, his remains were exhumed and returned to his homeland, where he was reinterred with full honors. In 1969, Marcus Garvey was named a National Hero of Jamaica and given the title His Right Excellent. In January 2025, the outgoing United States President Joe Biden gave Garvey an unconditional pardon. Marcus Garvey was a man of boundless ambition. He experienced many triumphs and tribulations. Though his journey ended in exile, his vision of black empowerment lives on, inspiring generations. Garvey's UNIA was both revolutionary and flawed. But without his vision, later leaders like Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah might not have had the foundation they built upon. Perhaps Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best on a visit to Jamaica when he said that Marcus Garvey was the first man of color to lead and develop a mass movement. He was the first man to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny on a mass scale and level. And he was the first man to make the Negro feel that he was somebody.